Are you ready to hear an intriguing tale? One that blends old folk legends with a touch of history. Today, I'll be guiding you through the story of the excavation of Barrow, an adventure game set in the mysterious north of England during the late 1800s. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unusual, with a twist you won't see coming. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. There's a link to my page in the description below. And now, let's get started. It's the late 1800s in the heart of Victorian England. The air is thick with the essence of a time steeped in tradition and mystery. We follow Miss Thomasina Bateman, a determined antiquarian, as she journeys by train from London to a remote village called Bewley, nestled in the northeast of England. This is the land of the moors, a vast untamed stretch of hills covered in shrubs, where the winds carry stories of old. Just days ago, Thomasina received an intriguing letter from Mr. Leonard Shoulder, inviting her to assist in an excavation. You see, Thomasina is an expert in barrows, ancient burial mounds, and she's always on the lookout for exciting new sites to explore. This particular barrow, Barrow, lies just outside Bewley and is steeped in local legends. Whispers of secrets buried deep within have stirred her curiosity. It's the kind of invitation she could never refuse, for this is not merely her job, but a vocation passed down by her father, William, who once shared the same passion for unearthing the past. As Miss Bateman steps off the train at the small, rain-soaked Bewley station, she notices no one is there, not even the station master. Only the steady drizzle of rain fills the silence, a common occurrence in this part of the world. Suddenly, from the misty gloom, an old woman appears out of nowhere. Though her manner is somewhat brusque, she's kind enough to direct Thomasina toward the Plough and Farrow Inn, where she's to meet Mr. Shoulder. But before she leaves, the woman gives an ominous warning. There's not much for you here in Bewley, love. Best take the next train back to the city while you can. Thomasina, undeterred, knows that villages in isolated places like this often harbor a distrust for strangers, especially those who come seeking the unknown. After a short damp walk, Thomasina arrives in the village. It feels desolate, as if time itself has forgotten this place. The buildings are weathered and worn, their windows dark and shuttered, and the few shops seem long abandoned. In the village square stands the Plough and Farrow Inn. Its warmth and light, a welcome contrast to the dreariness outside. As she approaches the entrance, a drunken man stumbles toward her, his breath heavy with ale. Thomasina deftly sidesteps his advances with a firm yet polite reminder that perhaps his wife is waiting for him at home. Inside, the inn is cozy, with a small gathering of patrons basking in the glow of the fireplace, enjoying hearty food and drinks. Thomasina approaches the innkeeper and secures a room for herself and her assistant, Kenneth, who is due to arrive the following day. After settling in, she freshens up and prepares to meet Mr. Shoulder, the man who brought her here. With Mr. Shoulder yet to arrive, Thomasina strikes up a conversation with Stanley Kemp, the innkeeper. Stanley is a kind man with stories of his own. He's been running the inn for the past 16 years, after saving enough from his years working all over the country. They chat about Bewley, and Stanley confirms he knows Mr. Shoulder. However, it seems Mr. Shoulder is not here yet, leaving Thomasina with more time to fill. Fortunately, Stanley is good company. As they talk, Thomasina explains her work, her excavation of ancient barrows across England, all for an upcoming book she's writing, Vestiges of Antiquity in Rural England. Her passion for uncovering history runs deep, passed down from her father, William, who was also a barrow digger. Sadly, he now lies in a coma, bedridden after a terrible horse accident that happened about 25 years ago. Stanley listens intently, clearly fascinated by her story, until she mentions Obbs Barrow. At this, his expression changes, his face becoming blank. He tells her he's never heard of such a place, despite the fact that, according to Mr. Shoulder's letter, the barrow is known in local legends. Something feels off. What could this mean? After her pleasant conversation with Stanley, Thomasina realizes that Mr. Shoulder still hasn't appeared. With time to spare, she decides to mingle with the patrons of the inn. However, not all of them share Stanley's friendliness. Take Cyril, for example, a grumpy old man who sits in the corner brooding. He grumbles about the railway, muttering that it will only bring trouble to Bewley, now that outsiders can reach the village. Of course, Thomasina knows better. She's likely the first visitor Bewley has seen in months, if not longer. It's hard to imagine anyone traveling to this remote village to cause trouble. After all, Bewley is home to little more than a church and a handful of houses, and the ever-present moors stretching out endlessly beyond the horizon. Thomasina knows it's best not to engage with Cyril's pessimistic ramblings, so she quietly leaves him to his bluster. Besides, she expects Mr. Shoulder to arrive any moment now. But as the hours slip by, no sign of Mr. Shoulder. Just as Thomasina prepares to retire for the night, the man she met earlier, the intoxicated fellow, reappears. Though initially displeased to see him again, she's taken aback when he approaches to apologize for his earlier behavior. His name is Arthur Tillett, and to Thomasina's surprise, he claims to know Mr. Shoulder. Eager for information, she buys him an nail, hoping to learn more. Unfortunately, things don't go as planned. Arthur is still very much inebriated, struggling to keep his eyes open. He excuses himself to the lavatory, but after quite some time passes, he fails to return. Growing concerned, Thomasina decides to check on him, only to find the restrooms empty, save for a scruffy grey cat glaring at her from the corner. Puzzled, she notices a door leading to the back alley, but it's jammed, seemingly blocked from the outside. Determined to find out what's going on, she ventures around the building to reach the alley from another direction. As she approaches, she catches a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the shadows. A man, but not Arthur. Who could it be? When she reaches the blocked back door, she finds a piece of wood lodged against it, along with a single white glove lying on the ground. But of Arthur, no trace. Did he block the door and flee? If so, why? The whole situation feels unsettling, leaving Thomasina with more questions than answers. With no leads, Thomasina decides to chase the figure she spotted, heading toward the eastern outskirts of the village. But Bewley, now shrouded in darkness and drenched in rain, is not a place to wander aimlessly. The man she pursued is long gone, disappearing into the desolate moors. Realizing she's lost her way, she wisely heads back to the inn, just as Stanley calls for last orders. The day has been long, and tomorrow will be even busier. Thomasina must find Mr. Shoulder, and with her assistant Kenneth arriving by midday, she'll finally have the equipment and funds she needs to begin her work. Later that night, Thomasina falls into a deep, exhausted sleep. But it's not long before something pulls her from her slumber. The scruffy cat from earlier has somehow found its way into her room, now perched on her bed, staring at her with piercing eyes. It feels as if the cat is trying to read her thoughts, its gaze unwavering and intense. Thomasina closes her eyes just for a moment, and when she opens them again, the cat is gone. As quickly as she was awakened, sleep claims her once more. A few hours later, Thomasina stirs awake, her mind foggy with a lingering memory of the night before. Was it all just a dream? She checks the door to her room, still locked, just as she left it when she went to bed. It must have been a dream, she tells herself, though it felt so vivid, so real. Pushing aside the unsettling thought, she heads downstairs to join Stanley. They chat for a while, making arrangements for her assistant arrival and deciding where to store her bulky excavation equipment. The alley behind the inn seems to be a suitable spot. But Stanley has something else on his mind, a confession he needs to make. He apologizes to Thomasina for not being entirely truthful. It turns out he does know about Ops Barrow. Most people in Bewley do. They all know it's a place best left undisturbed. There are dark rumors surrounding the Barrow, whispers that warn against meddling with what lies Shoulder. He knows him all too well. Stanley advises her to steer clear of both the Barrow and the man. But Thomasina is not one to be swayed by old tales and superstitions. Legends, she believes, are just that, legends. She has no intention of abandoning her plan. First, however, she needs to find Mr. Shoulder and the location of Hobbs Barrow. Unfortunately, Stanley cannot help her with that. He genuinely doesn't know where the Barrow is or where Mr. Shoulder resides. For that, Thomasina will need to ask around the village, and so she sets off on her quest. To her relief, the rain from the previous day has cleared, leaving behind a crisp, fresh morning. The sky is bright, and the village looks much more alive. There are more people about, and the overall atmosphere feels less dreary than the day before. Thomasina begins asking around about Mr. Shoulder and the Barrow, but her inquiries are met with vague answers and guarded looks. No one seems to know exactly where Mr. Shoulder lives, and any mention of Hobbs Barrow is greeted with strange, almost fearful glances. One after another, the villagers caution her not to meddle with it. Still, the people are friendly enough. The blacksmith, for example, who has lived in Bewley his entire life, enjoys collecting fossils. Or Mrs. de Plancy, who is selling delicious Bakewell puddings to raise funds for St. Edmund's Church. By all accounts, those puddings are the best around, and everyone in the village seems to love them. It's a shame Thomasina doesn't have enough money to buy one just yet, but with her assistant due to arrive soon, she'll have more funds at her disposal. In the next episode, Thomasina's search for Mr. Shoulder continues, but he remains elusive. Perhaps it's time to shift focus and try to find Hobbs Barrow on her own. However, the locals aren't exactly eager to help. They seem determined to keep her from meddling in the Barrow's secrets. Yet, just when all hope seems lost, unexpected help arrives from a surprising source. Previously on Hobbs Barrow. In the late 1800s, in Victorian England, we follow the story of Miss Thomasina Bateman, an antiquarian invited to excavate Hobbs Barrow, located just outside the remote village of Bewley in the north of England. She was called to the village by Mr. Leonard Shoulder, who mysteriously failed to meet her at the Plough and Furrow Inn as promised. Determined to find Mr. Shoulder, Thomasina asked around the village, but no one seemed to know where he lived. However, Mrs. de Plancy, a kind elderly lady, might have a clue. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. The link to my page is in the description. Mrs. de Plancy kindly suggests that Father Roach might know where Leonard Shoulder lives. It's still early, so the father is likely out for his morning exercise in the Erne Woods, just west of the church. Without delay, Thomasina heads to the woods and soon finds Father Roach. After a brief introduction, the father tells her that Leonard Shoulder lives in a remote cottage east of town on the moors. It's quite a walk, but he's willing to guide her there. As they walk, their conversation turns to the village and its surroundings. Thomasina learns that the land around Bewley, including the village itself, belongs to Lord Penswick. The Lord, though highly regarded, is somewhat of a recluse and rumoured to be quite eccentric. He rarely leaves his mansion, and is said to be restoring an older church near his home, convinced that the land has lost its connection to God. An odd belief, considering St. Edmund's Church stands just outside the village, and it too is in desperate need of repairs. After a lengthy trek across the moors, they finally arrive at Mr. Shoulder's cottage. Isolated and surrounded by nothing but the wide expanse of the moors, the house is tucked far from the village. Mr. Shoulder certainly values his privacy, Thomasina muses. She eagerly knocks on the door, but there is no answer. Undeterred, she knocks again, this time calling out for Leonard. Still no reply, just the clucking of the hens and the crow of a nearby rooster. Glancing around, she notices a clothesline at the back of the cottage, where laundry is hanging to dry. One item in particular catches her eye, a single white glove. It looks all too familiar. Reaching into her pocket, she retrieves the glove she found in the alley the night before. It's a perfect match. So Leonard Shoulder was at the inn after all. But why did he flee without meeting her? The whole situation grows stranger by the moment. With no one home, Thomasina decides to head back to the village. On her way, she makes up her mind. If she can't find Leonard Shoulder, she'll locate Barrow herself. After all, she didn't come all the way from London just to give up. She came for an excavation, and that's exactly what she's going to do. As Thomasina makes her way back to the village, she hears the distant whistle of the train echoing through the air. Finally, Kenneth has arrived, which means her precious equipment is here too, along with a bit of extra money to help with her expenses. She hurries to the railway station, excitement building up, only to find no one. Kenneth and her equipment are nowhere in sight. The station master, however, is at his post today, and to her surprise, it's none other than Mr. Tillett. That explains his absence yesterday. He was at the inn getting drunk. Seizing the moment, Thomasina approaches him, determined to get an explanation for his strange behavior the previous evening. She starts by asking about last night. Why did he disappear so abruptly? Mr. Tillett, still groggy from his drinking, seems puzzled, his face clouded with confusion. At first he doesn't even recognize Thomasina. Slowly, fragments of his memory begin to return, but they are hazy at best. His mind is a blur, barely able to recall the events of the night before. One thing he is certain of, however. He insists he doesn't know Leonard Shoulder. This comes as a shock to Thomasina. Just last night, he had claimed the opposite. Was he in line to get a free drink? Or is something else at play here. Another odd piece to add to the puzzle of this strange village. Rather than pushing him further, Thomasina switches her focus and asks about Kenneth and her belongings. Mr. Tillett explains that no passengers disembarked from the train. Only a few crates were unloaded by Mr. Price, the postmaster. But there is good news. One of the crates was large, and it had a red ribbon around it. That's Thomasina's crate. Unfortunately, it's now locked away in the postmaster's storeroom. Thomasina wastes no time and heads straight to the postmaster's depot, located just north of the Plough and Farrow Inn. However, upon arrival, she finds the door locked, and the postmaster is nowhere to be found. According to Mr. Long, a neighbor, the postmaster has left for Bakewell and won't be back for a few days. In his absence, Mr. Long has taken it upon himself to guard the warehouse and its contents. Well, this is just perfect. Thomasina needs to retrieve her crate as soon as possible, but with Mr. Long standing watch, how can she possibly get inside? For now, she decides to put that dilemma aside and takes a walk to clear her head. Perhaps a little fresh air will spark some inspiration. After a few minutes of wandering without any real destination, she finds herself near a small beck northwest of the church. There, a little girl is playing with her dolls, looking rather forlorn. Thomasina approaches, curious about what's troubling the child. The girl's name is Jane, and she explains that her brother, Wally, took her favorite doll, Myrtle, and refuses to give it back. Thomasina has no real desire to get involved in a sibling quarrel, but then Jane mentions that she knows where Ops Barrow is. Well, that changes things. Reluctantly, Thomasina agrees to help retrieve Myrtle in exchange for directions to the Barrow. Babysitting wasn't exactly on her list of tasks for today, but this is the first real lead, she said, and she can't afford to pass it up. And so Thomasina sets off to find Wally. Her first stop is the Ern Woods, but she finds no sign of him there. Instead, she stumbles upon three men hard at work chopping trees. There's also a distinguished gentleman who seems to be in charge, possibly the owner of the woods. Before Thomasina can greet him, he rushes off, pausing only to give her a quick compliment before disappearing into the woods. Why is everyone around here so odd? She wonders. With the path ahead blocked by fallen trees, she decides to search elsewhere for Wally. Finally, she finds him sitting on the grass east of the village. But when she asks about the doll, Wally says he gave it to the fair folk, the fairies as he calls them. Wonderful. Now Thomasina has to find where these fairies live and retrieve the doll. Fortunately, it's not as difficult as it sounds. Just outside Bewley's graveyard, she notices a circle of mushrooms with a freshly disturbed patch of earth in the center. Using her trusty trowel, she digs through the soil and unearths Myrtle, covered in mud and worms. As she digs, memories of her own childhood come floating back. At Wally and Jane's age, she too believed in fairies. She would marvel at the circles of mushrooms, convinced they were portals to the fairy kingdom. But her father had no patience for such fantasies. He always told her that fairies weren't real, and that science could explain everything. Looking back, his words were harsh, but they shaped the woman she is today. One who relies on reason and facts, never swayed by old superstitions or folklore. And yet, in this strange village, where legends seem to lurk in every shadow, it's hard not to feel the weight of those old tales. With myrtle in hand, Thomasina returns to Jane, though not before pocketing a hairpin she finds tucked into the doll's waist, just in case it might be useful later. Jane is overjoyed to have her doll back, but when Thomasina expects her to fulfill her part of the bargain, Jane darts off, challenging Thomasina to find her. Oh dear, now Thomasina has to chase Jane all over the village. After some searching, she spots Jane disappearing into the woods. Following her trail, Thomasina hears giggling coming from a badger hole. Resigned, she crouches down to investigate, only to discover a sleeping badger inside. She quickly retreats, only to find Jane standing nearby, watching with wide eyes, clearly amused by the scene. Finally, Jane agrees to reveal the location of Barrow. She has to go north, past the church graveyard, up a hill, and then reach a farm owned by a man named Mr. Bryden. That's where the Barrow is located. In the end, chasing Jane through the village wasn't entirely a waste of time. Thomasina has learned the location of Barrow, and in the process her mind feels clearer. As she reflects on recent events, she recalls a few details she had missed earlier. Details that could help her retrieve her crate from the postmaster's storeroom. In particular, during her conversation with Mr. Long, the postmaster's neighbor, it became obvious how enthusiastic he is about the new railway station in Bewley. He is filled with excitement about the idea of visitors coming from far and wide. Meanwhile, Cyril, the old man Thomasina met yesterday, has the complete opposite view of the railway. He detests the idea of outsiders disturbing the peace of Bewley. A plan forms clearly in Thomasina's mind. She opens a tab at the inn and invites both Mr. Long and Cyril for a pint. Naturally, they are more than happy to oblige. But when they meet, sparks begin to fly. Each man tries to convince the other how utterly wrong they are about the railway, and soon enough they're caught in a heated bickering match. This is exactly the distraction Thomasina needed. With the storeroom unguarded, she quickly uses the hairpin she took from the doll to unlock the door and finally get her hands on the crate. She moves the crate through the village, safely stowing it away in the alley behind the inn. Inside she finds a letter from Kenneth, her assistant. In it he explains that an urgent matter has come up in London, preventing him from joining her in Bewley. Fortunately, all of her equipment has arrived with the crate, though, much to her disappointment, the extra money she was expecting is not included. Oh well, never mind. In the next episode. At last, Thomasina discovers Barrow on Mr. Bryden's farm. But Mr. Bryden refuses to give her the permission to dig. The Barrow, he warns, holds dark secrets that should remain sealed forever. Will Thomasina heed his warning, or press on with her quest? Previously on Barrow. Miss Thomasina Bateman has come to Bewley to excavate an ancient ancient Barrow. However, the locals are reluctant to assist her, and many have tried to persuade her to abandon her mission. Despite the resistance, she finally uncovers the location of Barrow. Yet, gaining permission to excavate proves to be another challenge, especially with the dark secrets that lie buried within, secrets that perhaps should remain sealed. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. The link to my page is in the description. With the great situation resolved, Thomasina sets off once again, this time from Mr. Braden's farm, north of the village, to finally reach Barrow. It's a long walk across the moors, but after some time she arrives at the farm. The farmhouse is surrounded by vast fertile fields, a sharp contrast to the wildness of the moors beyond. Mr. Braden is at home, and after introducing herself and explaining her purpose, Thomasina learns that the Barrow is indeed located on his land. However, Mr. Braden is reluctant to give her permission to excavate it. His reason is simple and deeply personal. 25 years ago, there was another attempt to excavate the Barrow. His brother Samuel, along with 2 other men, had tried to uncover its secrets, but whatever they found inside drove Samuel to madness. He returned from the Barrow barely able to speak, and not long after, he tragically took his own life. Thomasina can't help but wonder who the other 2 men were. Unfortunately, Mr. Braden wasn't living in Bewley at the time, and doesn't know who they were. He does, however, know Mr. Shoulder, though it's been some time since he last saw him. According to Mr. Braden, Leonard Shoulder is plagued by various ailments and rarely leaves his cottage. So why didn't he answer the door when I knocked earlier? Thomasina wonders to herself. Mr. Braden's firm stance against another excavation is understandable. After what happened to his brother, he fears for anyone who might suffer the same fate. Though he denies permission to excavate, Mr. Braden does allow Thomasina to visit the site. After all, she's come all the way from London, and surely a simple visit won't do any harm, or so he hopes. A short walk through the fields leads Thomasina to the Barrow. From the outside, it appears rather unremarkable, just a rectangular mound covered in grass and moss. Yet, standing before it, she can't shake the feeling that this Barrow holds secrets far beyond the ordinary. As she runs her hand over the mossy surface, she has a sudden vivid vision of the wonders that might lie within. I must convince Mr. Braden to let me excavate, she thinks to herself. That's what I'll do tomorrow. But for now, the day is drawing to a close. The sky darkens, and the rain begins to fall once again. It's time for Thomasina to head back to the inn for the night, after a long and fruitful day. Sadly, her sleep is far from peaceful. In the dead of the night, she's thrown into a disturbing nightmare. In her dream, she finds herself back at Barrow. The wind howls around her, and though the sun shines, its light has taken on an eerie fuchsia hue, casting everything in a strange otherworldly glow. Before the Barrow stands a cloaked figure, its presence unsettling, almost monstrous. The creature knows her by name and speaks in a voice that chills her to the bone. It tells her that it was the one who saved her father 25 years ago, pulling him from the Barrow when something went terribly wrong. Now it offers to help him again. It promises proof of this in the morning. The creature's final words ring in her ears. This is not a dream. And with that, the dream ends all of a sudden. Thomasina awakens, her mind still troubled by the strange, vivid dream. As she prepares to leave her room, something catches her eye. A book lying by the door. Curious, she picks it up, opening its worn pages, only to discover that it's a journal. The entries describe the thoughts of someone arriving in this very area, filled with excitement about beginning an excavation, likely at Barrow. But the final pages are unsettling, filled with strange symbols and cryptic terms that seem almost esoteric. Naturally, Thomasina dismisses it all as nonsense, hogwash, as she likes to say. Along with the journal, she finds a small stone carved with the image of a cockerel and some curious letters. Thomasina hurries downstairs, journal and stone in hand, and asks Stanley if he had left the items in her room. Stanley looks perplexed. He assures her he hadn't placed anything in her room, nor does he know how the items got there. She recounts her dream to him, describing the eerie creature she encountered. Stanley, now visibly intrigued, recalls an old folk tale about a goblin that was said to live within Barrow, a hobgoblin, from which the Barrow supposedly takes its name, but he can't remember much more. As expected, Thomasina brushes off the story as mere superstition, labeling it hogwash. There's no time to dwell on such tales. Today will be another busy day, filled with challenges. She needs to convince Mr. Bryden to allow her to excavate the Barrow and unravel the mystery of the journal's origin. The morning fog still clings to the village as Thomasina strolls through Bewley. It's market day and the merchants are setting up their stalls. As she nears the back where she met Jane, she sees a familiar figure, the old gentleman she briefly encountered the day before. This time he is painting, standing quietly beside the water. Perhaps we'll exchange proper introductions, she muses. But the conversation that follows is far from ordinary. The man already knows who she is, and introduces himself simply as James. His tone a curious mix of flattery and jest. He tells her that he's painting a new world, and she will be its shining star. When Thomasina tries to ask about Barrow, Leonard Shoulder, or even Lord Panswick, James skillfully dodges her questions, shifting the focus back to her. He seems more interested in learning about her, what she enjoys, what she dislikes. Half amused, half annoyed, Thomasina gives vague answers, even making up a few things, just to see how he reacts. Eventually, deciding she's had enough of his peculiar behavior, she moves on. As she continues her walk past the Earn Woods, she runs into Mr. Tillett. Today he appears much more sober and far less confused than before. Thomasina shows him the journal, hoping it might offer some insight, but he admits he can't make sense of it. However, he suggests she shows it to Mother Mildred, a local woman known for her knowledge of potions and spells, a witch by some accounts. Perhaps, he says, she can decipher the strange symbols. After a relatively short walk in the woods, Thomasina finally arrives at Mother Mildred's cottage, where she's busy picking up berries from a nearby bush. To her surprise, it turns out that Mother Mildred, or rather Mildred Walker, that's her real name, is actually the old lady she met at the train station when she first arrived. But that's not the only surprise. When Thomasina introduces herself, Mrs. Walker suddenly comments, "I thought I recognized you when I met you at the station. You have your father's eyes." Those words send a chill down Thomasina's spine. Her father was in Bewley. How's that possible? Mildred confirms it. William Bateman was indeed in Bewley 25 years ago, helping Samuel Bryden excavate Ops Barrow. She met him because he sought a remedy for his wife's pregnancy nausea at the time, Thomasina's mother. And that's true. Thomasina remembers her mother being pregnant with a second child when she was about 5. But due to her father's tragic fate, her mother lost the baby. This revelation shakes Thomasina to her core. But there's more. She suddenly remembers that the journal mentions a local wise lady who provided a remedy for morning pregnancy nausea. Could the journal have been written by her father? But how could that be? The journal is filled with symbols and esoteric notes, things that seem so out of character for him. Mildred goes on to reveal that William visited her twice, once for the remedy and once to ask if she knew anything about binding magic. Binding magic? Thomasina can hardly believe her ears. Her father was a man of logic, of reason. This all goes against everything she knew about him. For the first time, a doubt creeps into her mind. Did she truly know her father as well as she thought? She asks Mildred for more details about the excavation, but she knows little. Only that Samuel Bryden took his life soon after, and as far as she knows, only William Bateman and Samuel were involved. Yet Thomasina is certain there was a third man. Who could it be? As Thomasina leaves Mildred's cottage, her thoughts churn with new questions about her father, the creature from her dream, and what really happened 25 years ago. Her father has been bedridden, unable to speak, for as long as she can remember. Her mother always said it was due to a horse accident, but now Thomasina knows that can't be true. The accident must have happened inside Ops Barrow, but what could have caused it? The creature in her dream had promised to help her father, just as it did once before. Could there be something inside the barrow that could help him recover? But such a thing would be magic, and magic, of course, is nothing but hogwash, isn't it, Thomasina? Lost in thought, she reaches the edge of the woods, where Mr. Tillett still lingers, deep in his own troubled thoughts. He seems to be struggling with a memory, but it's tangled up in the fog of his recent drinking. Thomasina tries to share her own discoveries, but he barely hears her. Perhaps tonight at the inn, she thinks, and moves on. There's still so much left to do today. Most importantly, Thomasina needs to find a way to convince Mr. Bryden to allow her to excavate up Barrow. But there's no time to dwell on that just yet. As she walks through the church graveyard, she notices an old man sitting on a bench, staring out over the moors. As she approaches, he turns and asks, "Are you Thomasina Bateman?" She nods, and he introduces himself as Leonard Shoulder. Finally, the elusive Mr. Shoulder has appeared. There's so much they need to discuss, and indeed, their conversation is deeply intriguing. In the next episode, the tales surrounding Barrow are both fascinating and deeply unsettling, and somehow they seem to involve Thomasina's father. But even more shocking revelations await her, revelations that could hold the key to saving her father's life. Previously on Barrow. The strange events in Bewley continue to unravel. Thomasina must now convince Mr. Bryden to allow her to excavate the Barrow. She's more determined than ever, especially after discovering that her father attempted to excavate the very same site 25 years ago. Inside the Barrow may lie the answers to what happened to him, and possibly a way to save his life. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. The link to my page is in the description. Mr. Shoulder starts by apologizing for his absence. He explains that he has been bedridden with a terrible fever for the past few days. That explains why he didn't answer the door when Thomasina knocked yesterday. But it doesn't explain why he was spotted in the alley behind the inn. Strange. As they talk, Mr. Shoulder seems genuinely surprised to learn that Thomasina's father was involved in the attempt to excavate Barrow 25 years ago. He claims to have no knowledge of the journal Thomasina found earlier that morning either. His interest in excavating Barrow comes from the old folklore surrounding it, as well as the mystery of the failed expedition. Mr. Shoulder shares the tale of how 25 years ago Bewley was in the grip of a terrible crisis. The harvests had failed, and the early woods were plagued by a strange blight, berries rotting as soon as they grew. Livestock were dying, and the villagers grew desperate. Fear and panic began to spread. Many blamed Barrow for their misfortune. Local legends told of a goblin named Saxnot, who was said to dwell within the Barrow, and many believed that the Barrow was a thin place, where the divide between the physical world and the spirit world was dangerously thin. Saxnot was thought to be the guardian of this place, but a rumor took hold that Saxnot had grown displeased with the villagers and had cursed the land. The villagers became convinced that driving the goblin away would lift the curse and save Bewley. Whatever the expedition found in the Barrow seemed to have worked, for soon after, the harvests thrived, the blight vanished, and the livestock recovered. Thomasina, as expected, dismisses the story as nothing more than foolish superstition. She can't believe her father, a man of reason, would have participated in an expedition to rid a village of a goblin curse. Yet, despite herself, Thomasina can't shake a growing sense of unease. She's been invited, seemingly at random, to a remote village for an excavation. Then she discovers that her father had been here 25 years earlier, for the very same reason. Can that really be just a coincidence, as Mr. Shoulder suggests? And what about her dream, the creature that promised to help her father? Could she have dreamt of Saxnot, the goblin of local legend, before she had even heard the story? Another coincidence? It's too much to ignore. Slowly, she begins to entertain more irrational explanations, though she doesn't yet want to admit it. After her fascinating conversation with Mr. Shoulder, Thomasina heads straight to Mr. Bryden's farm, determined to secure his permission to excavate the Barrow. She finds him outside, as resolute as ever, refusing to allow the excavation to proceed. No matter what argument she presents, Mr. Bryden remains unmoved. That is, until she shows him the stone that came with her father's journal. Upon seeing it, Mr. Bryden goes pale. He hurries into his house and returns a few minutes later, holding another stone, this one carved with 2 serpents and a different set of letters. It was brought back by his brother, Samuel, from inside the Barrow. Another coincidence? Mr. Bryden doesn't think so. At last, he agrees to grant Thomasina permission to excavate the Barrow, but on one condition. He is convinced that something terrible is buried within, something that drove his brother mad and left Thomasina's father bedridden for the past 25 years. He demands that, at the very first sign of trouble, Thomasina will abandon the excavation, leave immediately, and seal up the Barrow for good. Thomasina, elated at having finally won the permission, agrees without hesitation. The dig can begin tomorrow, or so she hopes. She still needs to find able workers to help with the excavation, strong hands to do the heavy lifting. But where will she find them? It's been an eventful morning for Thomasina. As she returns to the village square, she notices that the market stalls are now fully set up, and the vendors are milling about. Among the crowd, she spots a woman dressed in a maid's uniform. Perhaps she works for Lord Panswick, Thomasina thinks. Maybe he can lend me some of his workers. Knowing that Lord Panswick isn't fond of visitors knocking on his door uninvited, Thomasina decides to approach the maid instead. The woman introduces herself as Miss Tompkins, a housemaid in the employ of Lord Panswick. She's in the village to collect milk from Mr. Ambrose, but he is nowhere to be found. Sensing an opportunity, Thomasina offers to fetch the milk in exchange for an introduction to Lord Panswick. Miss Tompkins is hesitant at first, but eventually agrees, if only to avoid the wrath of the housekeeper, Miss Fenchurch, for returning empty-handed. Now, where can Thomasina find some milk? The answer lies with Mr. Bryden, of course. She remembers seeing a goat at his farm earlier, likely providing fresh milk every morning. With that in mind, she heads back to Mr. Bryden and asks if she can milk the goat herself. Mr. Bryden agrees, but warns her that his goat is notoriously grumpy. It doesn't like strangers. And sure enough, the goat proves too unruly for Thomasina to handle. In the end, Mr. Bryden has to do the milking, but first he needs a remedy for his aching joints from Mother Mildred. Thomasina, eager to keep things moving, agrees to fetch the remedy for him. Thanks to the concoction, Mr. Bryden is finally able to milk the goat, and Thomasina can now deliver the milk to Miss Tompkins. Miss Tompkins breathes a sigh of relief as she sees Thomasina approaching with the fresh milk in hand. For now, it seems she won't be scolded by Miss Fenchurch, at least not today. Together they make their way to Penswick Manor, with Thomasina filled with anticipation at finally meeting Lord Penswick. But upon their arrival, things do not go as smoothly as she hoped. Miss Fenchurch is immediately displeased, both with the fact that Miss Tompkins brought goat's milk instead of the usual cow's milk, and with the presence of a stranger on the estate. Her irritation is palpable, and she refuses all of Thomasina's attempts to secure an audience with his lordship, even going as far as to threaten her with being shot if she doesn't leave the property at once. Fortunately, the tension quickly dissolves when Lord Penswick himself appears, and to Thomasina's surprise, she recognizes him. He is the very gentleman she had met earlier in the day. In hindsight, it seems obvious now, but at the time, Thomasina hadn't pieced it together. Lord Penswick greets her warmly, eager to know what brings her to his estate. As Thomasina explains her plans to excavate Obb's Barrow, his lordship leads her to the chapel he is restoring. He speaks of how his ancestors had turned their backs on God, abandoning the chapel, and now he is determined to restore it, rekindling his family's lost relationship with the divine. According to him, his fortunes have suffered since that connection was severed. But he is certain that by completing this restoration, his name will soon be known throughout all of England. Thomasina finds his talk fascinating, if a bit megalomaniac. Why is he telling me all this, she wonders. And has he forgotten about St. Edmund's Church? Oh well, as long as he lends me his workers, he can restore whatever he pleases. In the end, Lord Penswick agrees to lend Thomasina the workers she needs for the excavation. All he asks in return is that she brings him one of Mrs. de Plancy's famous big well puddings. The request is certainly odd, but by now Thomasina is hardly surprised by his lordship's eccentric whims. Unfortunately, this seemingly simple task causes a headache for Thomasina. Mrs. de Plancy has already promised the last of her puddings to Father Roach, and has no intention to bake more. After some persuasion, Thomasina manages to secure one pudding, and quickly returns to Lord Penswick. Amused by her persistence, his lordship reveals that he never really needed the pudding. He only wanted to test whether she had the tenacity to carry out such a peculiar request. And she did not disappoint. Though mildly irritated by this little game, Thomasina takes solace in the fact that now she has the help she needs for tomorrow's excavation. The sun is beginning to set, and the cold night air settles in. It's time for her to return to the Plough and Furrow Inn. The inn is buzzing with activity tonight. Mr. Tillet is there, Cyril too, and even Mr. Shoulder has made an appearance. But the real surprise is the arrival of Lord Penswick himself. He buys Thomasina a drink and invites everyone to toast in her honor, wishing her good fortune for tomorrow's excavation. After this unexpected display, Lord Penswick leaves as swiftly as he came. Though tired, Thomasina isn't quite ready to retire for the night. She notices Mr. Tillet trying to catch her attention from across the room, signaling that he has something important to tell her. He beckons her to follow him into the alley behind the inn, away from prying ears. What Mr. Tillet reveals is troubling, to say the least. The night he disappeared when they first met wasn't because he was drunk and confused. In fact, he remembers it all too clearly now. When he went to the lavatory that evening, he encountered a hooded figure who threatened him, warning him not to speak of what he had seen. At the time, Mr. Tillet had no idea what the figure was referring to, but now his memory is beginning to clear. 2 days before Thomasina arrived in Bewley, he had been sleeping off another drunken night in the Erne Woods, when he overheard the voices of 2 men. To his shock, the men were Lord Penswick and Mr. Shoulder. They were discussing the arrival of a woman in 2 days, and how it was her blood they needed. Lord Penswick was eager to bring this woman to the site immediately upon her arrival, but Mr. Shoulder insisted they proceeded with caution, that things wouldn't work unless she gave her blood willingly. Thomasina's heart skips a beat. They were talking about her. It wasn't a coincidence that she had been invited to Bewley. She had been lured here. But why? And what danger does she face? Despite the gravity of Mr. Tillet's revelation, Thomasina is resolute. It's too late to turn back now. She must excavate the Barrow, discover what lies within, and uncover the truth about her father. Perhaps now that she knows she's part of a carefully laid scheme, she can find a way to outsmart Lord Penswick and Mr. Shoulder, or at least play along until the time is right. Or so she thinks. In the next episode, the time to excavate Ops Barrow has finally arrived. As Thomasina ventures deeper and deeper into the burial mound, she uncovers something beyond her wildest imagination. But the consequences of this discovery will be far greater than she ever anticipated. Previously on Ops Barrow, Miss Thomasina Bateman, an antiquarian from London, has come to the remote village of Bewley in the north of England to excavate Ops Barrow. After facing numerous challenges in locating the site and securing the help she needs, the excavation can finally begin. Thomasina's excitement isn't fueled by the dark legends surrounding the Barrow, but by the hope that inside she may find something that could save her father's life. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. The link to my page is in the description. Thomasina returns to her room, preparing for what will undoubtedly be a long and intense day tomorrow. She needs all the rest she can get. But once again, her sleep is disturbed by a nightmare. In the dream, she stands before Ops Barrow once more, bathed in that strange fuchsia light. The goblin Saxnot is there, eager to speak. Saxnot reveals that Thomasina's father entered the Barrow 25 years ago with the intent to bind the goblin within it, believing that Saxnot was the cause of the village's plight. But Saxnot insists that the villagers were wrong. It wasn't his doing. In any case, William Bateman botched the incantation, leaving Saxnot in a weakened state, trapped in a limbo between worlds, where he can only reach out to Thomasina briefly in these dreams. Thomasina still struggles to believe that her father, a man of science, would perform such a ritual. But Saxnot continues, giving Thomasina clear instructions for tomorrow. She must enter the Barrow and undo the ritual her father performed. By doing so, Saxnot will regain his strength, and so will her father. This can only be accomplished if she spills her own blood. When the time comes, she'll know how and where to do it. Suddenly, the dream cuts off, and Thomasina finds herself awake, her mind reeling from the strange and unsettling vision. It's early morning on the day of the long-awaited excavation of Ops Barrow. As Thomasina heads downstairs, Stanley greets her with a note and a small key from Mr. Shoulder. In the note, Mr. Shoulder asks her to visit his house before going to the Barrow. There's something important he needs to give her. Without hesitation, Thomasina leaves the inn and heads for Mr. Shoulder's cottage. Unsurprisingly, he isn't home, but on his doorstep she finds a small box. Inside the box, she discovers another of those peculiar stones, like the one that came with her father's journal, and the one Mr. Bryden had from his brother. It suddenly clicks. Mr. Shoulder must have been the third man from the expedition. He lied to her, deceived her all along. But at this point it doesn't matter. The excavation must go on. She must save her father. A few minutes later, Thomasina arrives at the site to find Lord Penswick's workers already there. After several hours of labor, they finally remove the final layer of stone and mortar that seals the entrance of the Barrow. As the barrier is lifted, Thomasina's mind races with anticipation. But there's a moment of hesitation. Was the Barrow sealed to keep people out, or to prevent something from inside from getting out? That fleeting thought is quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming stench of decay that seeps from the Barrow. She steps inside, only to find what appears to be an empty cave, with flowers scattered on the floor. A strange and somewhat disappointing sight. But then she notices that the flowers are covering wooden boards, which appear to seal a passage leading deeper into the earth. Excitement surges through her veins. There's more to the Barrow than meets the eye. She turns to call for the workers to help her, but they're already gone. She's alone. How rude, she thinks to herself, but she's not deterred. Without hesitation, Thomasina ventures down the passage, which turns into a long, muddy and damp tunnel winding deep into the heart of the Barrow. As she presses on, her lantern flickers out, leaving her in darkness. But then she sees a faint light in the distance, a soft glowing light, as though the earth itself is alive. She follows it until she reaches the source, a stone door radiating the strange light. But how to open it? Upon closer inspection, she finds a panel beside the door. Removing it reveals 3 indentations, perfect fits for the stones she's gathered over the past few days. The stones slide into place, and with a grinding sound, the door unlocks. As Thomasina steps through, the door closes behind her, trapping her inside. Her initial panic quickly fades as she takes in her surroundings. The walls are adorned with paintings. There's a strange pottery lying around, and that eerie fuchsia glow she remembers from her dreams. Whoever built this place was far from primitive. Realizing there is no way back, Thomasina presses forward. She finds herself in what appears to be an ancient underground temple, filled with intricate mechanisms that block her path. The walls are covered in symbols, pagan symbols probably, but also Roman and Greek letters. There are also depictions of wild animals, the sun and the moon. These symbols stir a memory. Her father's journal had similar imagery in its final pages. With the help of his notes, Thomasina is able to decipher the symbols and unlock the mechanisms, granting her access to the temple's deeper chambers. Now Thomasina stands before 3 passageways. Which one will lead her forward? Again, her father's journal provides the answer. She must follow the moon, the star, and listen to his mouth. But what does that mean? Above each passage is a symbol that corresponds to the clues in her father's notes. She quickly chooses the correct path, and with each step she feels she's drawing closer, not just to the heart of this otherworldly place, but to her father as well. Along the way, she experiences brief visions of her teaching her about the wonders of excavation and ancient relics. At last she reaches the end of the labyrinth, but her journey isn't over yet. The path ahead continues, leading even deeper underground. Finally, she arrives at a massive structure with a vast entrance. It's clear she's now hundreds of meters below the surface. How could such a place exist? She's on the brink of discovering something beyond her wildest imagination. As Thomasina steps inside the structure, she finds herself standing before a small round patch of earth, encircled by 3 flickering eerie flames. At the center of the patch lies a metal tablet with an inscription roughly scratched into its surface. It appears to be an incantation. Saxnot's words echo in her mind from the dream. She knows what she must do. The time has come to spill her blood and undo her father's botched ritual. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomasina kneels, drawing a blade to cut the palm of her hand. She watches as her blood drips onto the soil beneath her. It's done. The ritual is complete. Suddenly, the ground trembles beneath her, and the thin veil between this world and the spirit realm begins to tear open. What Thomasina witnesses next defies all logic. It's something beyond description. In front of her, a being appears, a demon, a god brought to life. Panic surges through her. Thomasina turns around and runs, desperate to escape the Barrow alive. All the while, voices begin to whisper inside her mind, speaking in an ancient unknown tongue. The whispers grow louder and more intense with each step she takes. After what feels like an eternity, she finally sees a glimmer of light. The entrance to the Barrow. She's almost safe, or so she thinks. Just as she steps out, she collapses at the feet of Saxnot. The goblin looks down at her with a somber expression, as if filled with pity. It knows what is about to happen. In a final attempt, it tries to justify its actions, perhaps seeking forgiveness. Saxnot begins to explain. Thomasina's father had succeeded in binding them within the Barrow, trapping the dark entity that lurked beneath the soil. But over the years, they felt the corruption grow, an ever-increasing rage from the being that was bound alongside them, a force they could no longer contain. Saxnot fought against it, but in the end they succumbed, becoming nothing more than a tool for the malevolent entity. And so they deceived Thomasina, guiding her to release the very force her father had sought to imprison. Now the world will witness the rise of Abraxas Rex, the new god. In a blinding flash of light, the Barrow erupts. Saxnot is consumed by the beam, and Thomasina too is struck down by its power. Hours later, Lord Penswick and Mr. Shoulder arrive at the Barrow to find Thomasina lying unconscious. Both men appear jubilant. She had fulfilled their plans, just as they hoped. How Thomasina made her way back to London, or what transpired over the next 4 days, remains unknown. All that is certain is that one cold, dark evening she arrived at the Ticehurst Private Hospital, where her father had been cared for the past 25 years. Her presence was silent and grim, a reflection of the darkness now consuming her soul. She walked through the halls without a word, ignoring the nurses on duty, heading straight to her father's room. But the Thomasina that entered that room was not entirely herself. Like Saxnot, she had become a vessel, a tool for Abraxas, the demon or god her father fought against so long ago. Now, through Thomasina, Abraxas would take his vengeance, and it was her father's life he would claim. Back in Bewley, the restoration of the church near Penswick Manor has been completed. The villagers gather inside, awaiting the arrival of Abraxas Rex on his throne. Yet not all are willing to kneel to the new god. Mr. Tillett, Father Roach, Mrs. de Plancy, and Cyril stand in quiet defiance. Though how long will that be tolerated remains uncertain. Years later, we find Thomasina sitting in a damp, lonely prison cell, writing a letter to her mother. In the letter, she recounts the events that led her there, hoping perhaps for some glimmer of forgiveness, even though, deep down, she knows it may never come. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story, especially the dark twist at the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more relaxing ASMR gaming content. A special thank you to all my Ko-fi supporters. And if you'd like to support me as well, you can find the link to my page in the description below. Until next time, take care and stay relaxed.